Akreka shambipot. The sour stench of pus. A velvet sleeve soaked through with sweat. These were the daily fragments of life inside the royal apartments of Henry VIII, King of England, as winter crept into January of 1547. The corridors of Whitehall Palace echoed with ceremonial footsteps, but beneath the polished floors, something was rotting, literally. After his death, the swollen body of the king burst open in transit, spilling blackened fluids through his coffin seams. This was the fate of Henry Tudor, once a vibrant Renaissance prince, now a grotesque husk barely human in form, commanding from his bed more through fear than majesty. Today we descend into the final days of Henry VIII, where ritual masked ruin, and the king's flesh betrayed him faster than any courtly conspiracy ever could. The rot began years before his death. By 1546, Henry's legs were already failing him. What had once been the powerful frame of a hunting monarch was now propped up by elaborate braces and thick cushions. His weight, likely over 350 pounds, had turned every movement into torment. A pulley system was rumored to be installed above his bed, allowing attendants to hoist the monarch into a sitting position. Official portraits still rendered him regal, stoic, virile. But that image was curated, strategically deceptive. The real Henry lay cloaked in stasis, sweating through silks, the room heavy with vinegar and rosewater, masking something fouler. His courtiers knew. They always knew. And yet they bowed deeper, smiled broader, and praised the king's vigorous governance. Because to acknowledge his decay was to invite accusations of treason. The ulcer on his left leg, long a source of agony, had worsened. Physicians lanced it regularly, releasing sludgy yellow pus that sometimes contained pieces of dead flesh. The wound never closed. Putrefaction was the whispered term. Some claimed you could smell the king before you saw him. One court physician experimented with a concoction made of honey, moss, and powdered pearls, believing it would draw out the bad humors. Another applied poultices of cow dung and ash. But none could halt the stench or the pain. Even today, historians argue whether it was type 2 diabetes, chronic osteomyelitis, or untreated syphilis that accelerated the rot. And through it all, the pageantry continued. Trumpeters still heralded his rare appearances. Servants changed his robes thrice daily whether or not he'd moved. Banquets were prepared in case the king requested a morsel. He often did. His appetite, grotesquely intact, became the court's cruel joke. It took 4 men to lift him into a chair, but he would still demand roasted swan, whole pies stuffed with smaller pies and capons soaked in claret. He chewed with grinding molars, most of his teeth gone, leaving his gums blackened and his breath fetid. A dog once vomited beneath the banquet table after lingering too close. Still he ate. And the more he consumed, the less he digested. Constipation turned violent. Enemas of wine and myrrh were prescribed. He bled from the gums, the nose, and once, according to an unnamed page, from the eyes like weeping ink. The royal physicians took to recording his symptoms in code, terrified of the consequences should the truth reach the Privy Council. Henry's own temper could be fatal. He'd had men beheaded for far less than an offensive diagnosis. This decay was not merely physical, it infected the whole court. Everything revolved around maintaining the illusion that Henry was still strong, still divine, still ruling by the grace of God. But in truth he hadn't walked more than 10 feet unaided in over a year. Even the architecture bowed to his failing flesh. A ramp was built from his bedchamber to the chapel, wide enough for 6 servants to wheel him along like an icon in a pageant. He would clutch a crucifix, silent, sweat streaming down his jowls as he nodded vaguely toward courtiers who swore they saw clarity in his eyes. In reality, Henry often hallucinated. Some say he spoke to his dead brother Arthur in the night. Others claimed he would weep openly, asking God why he had taken Jane Seymour and left him with ghosts for heirs. And still the throne stood, empty often, but watched. Everyone knew the game. Whoever stood closest when the king finally died might control the future. But no one dared move too soon. The irony? Henry was fully aware of the performance. He controlled it, demanded it. Even as his own flesh defied him, he commanded the orchestra of denial. He ordered new vestments for the chapel choir, gold-threaded, and commissioned a portrait of himself in full armor for the walls of Hampton Court. His will was amended and re-amended, with clauses designed to keep Edward's protectors under his ghostly thumb. Power, he believed, must continue posthumously. He intended to rule from the grave. One chilly morning, as frost glazed the palace windows, a nurse found the king slumped awkwardly, his skin an alarming shade of purple. He was alive, but his pulse was shallow. She screamed. The doctor on duty bled him at once, standard procedure though now considered likely to hasten death. The blood barely dripped. A few hours later he was upright again, demanding quail and sugar almonds. It was like watching a corpse rehearse resurrection. That's when the rumors began. Whispers of death behind heavy curtains. Couriers sent at odd hours. A boy allegedly saw the royal apothecary carrying something wrapped in waxed cloth that dripped brown liquid. No one ever found out what it was. Henry was dying, but in England the king could not die until it was politically convenient. Until the court was ready. Until every mask was in place. And so they all pretended, for now.
By mid-January of 1547, Whitehall was less a palace and more a hive of whispers. Behind the painted tapestries and candlelit corridors, the air grew heavy with suspicion. Courtiers passed each other with practiced politeness, but their eyes flickered, calculating. Everyone knew, the king's breath was shallow, his limbs unresponsive, his mind increasingly unreliable. But none dared to say the words aloud. Because in Henry's court, to speak of the king's death before it happened was treason. And so the game of shadows began. At the center of it all was the Privy Council, a select group of men who had once obeyed Henry's commands without question. Now, they obeyed silence. The king lay dying, and the council dared not move. Every decision, no matter how mundane, was delayed, hedged, or wrapped in ceremonial flourishes to obscure the fact that the throne was already functionally vacant. Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford and brother to the late Queen Jane Seymour, watched with hawk-like precision. He had long positioned himself as guardian to Prince Edward, Henry's sole legitimate son. But others watched him too. Bishop Gardiner whispered to Catholic allies. Sir Anthony Denny, Henry's most trusted gentleman of the bedchamber, recorded every word spoken in the king's presence, then filtered what reached the council. Even the servants were carefully selected, their loyalties checked, their movements watched. It wasn't just politics anymore. It was survival. Henry's bedchamber became the inner sanctum of paranoia. No one entered without permission. And those who did were watched. The king sometimes muttered orders in Latin, sometimes recited psalms with perfect clarity, and sometimes stared into the canopy, speaking to a child that wasn't there. Denny kept a record of these incidents, though most of it never left his chamber. He feared, rightly, that the king's instability might provoke a crisis. If the European courts caught wind of Henry's mental decline, England could be seen as vulnerable. The memory of royal weakness still stung from the days of Richard II. It was Denny who eventually posed the forbidden question, did His Majesty wish to confess and prepare for death? Henry, lucid in that moment, refused. Repeatedly. Confession implied death was near. And Henry, ever the orchestrator, would not allow death to come without his cue. Some scholars believe this delay was intentional, others argue he feared damnation for his many executions, divorces, and ecclesiastical upheavals. By now, Henry slept rarely. He feared closing his eyes. If I dream, he reportedly said to one physician, the Pope will drag me into hell by my feet. It wasn't entirely irrational. His final years had been soaked in betrayal and blood. His wives, 2 dead, 1 divorced, 1 executed. His closest advisors, many imprisoned or beheaded. His old friend Thomas More had died cursing him. His old servant Thomas Cromwell died because he brought him Anne of Cleves. Henry feared ghosts, not metaphorical ones. Real ones. He believed they waited for him. And the palace fed that fear. Torches guttered strangely near his chambers. Footsteps were heard on the gallery floors long after the guards had been dismissed. One nurse claimed she saw a pale woman in a French hood standing by the king's bedside at dawn. Another swore she saw a child disappear into the tapestries. None reported it formally. Not because they were afraid of ghosts, but because they were afraid of being accused of madness. The king's mental state was mirrored by the courts. Ministers refused to sign letters. Ambassadors were kept in diplomatic limbo. Parliament, already dissolved, would not be summoned again until a new monarch ruled. Everything froze, held in a breathless, feverish stasis. One day, Henry demanded to see a mirror. This was unusual, he hadn't looked at his own reflection in months. The servants brought a silver-backed one, polished to gleam. They propped him up with cushions, adjusted the candlelight. He stared for a long time. Then, in a voice rough with phlegm, he asked, "Is this the face of a king?" No one answered. Because by then, the face in the mirror was no longer recognizable. His eyes were bloodshot and crusted at the corners. His cheeks were cavernous, collapsing into folds. His nose sagged, pitted with broken vessels. The jowls beneath his chin had fused into something shapeless. Even the once auburn beard was mostly gray and stained with saliva. There was no grandeur in that face. Only ruin. It was a courtier, Thomas Wriothesley, Lord Chancellor, who broke the silence. "Majesty, you wear the burden of empire." It was a lie, of course. But in Henry's court, lies were the currency of survival. Even the palace architecture took on a paranoid hue. Extra guards were posted near the treasury. Secret passages were monitored. All correspondence was copied by scribes loyal to the Seymours. Lady Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, wrote letters daily, but few reached her. Some were intercepted. Others were read aloud before being burned. Meanwhile, Henry's signature became shakier. Denny had begun using the dry stamp, a device that embossed the king's signature onto documents with a press, allowing orders to continue without Henry's direct involvement. It was meant to preserve royal control. In practice, it enabled quiet manipulation. And still, the king lingered. Those final weeks felt eternal. Ice spread across the Thames, freezing the world in place. A frost fair was suggested, but quickly dismissed. No one wanted to celebrate under the shadow of a dying monarch. The court musicians practiced in silence. The chapel choir sang, but only when ordered. The court jesters vanished. A silence reigned. A silence that reeked of fear. And yet, within this silence, there was motion. Realignments. Side glances. Power plays wrapped in smiles. Titles were discussed. Inheritance debated. Nobody wanted to appear eager, but nobody wanted to be late. Even young Prince Edward, just 9 years old, was kept at a guarded distance. He asked to see his father. The request was denied. Later, he was seen crying by a window, watching the snowfall. By now, Henry's body had begun to betray its final signals. The skin across his belly thinned, stretched tight like an overfilled bladder. The ulcer on his leg oozed almost constantly. A new one had begun to form on the other leg. His breath rattled. Sometimes, he urinated blood. Physicians whispered the phrase, incipient rupture. They feared that, if not already dead internally, he soon would be. But no proclamation could be made. Not yet. Not until the machinery of succession was perfectly positioned. Not until the final lie could be told convincingly. The king is well enough to rest. He sends his prayers. He rules still. And so, in the darkest wing of a dying palace, the body of England's most feared monarch rotted in regal silence, watched by men who dared not speak the truth, lest the shadows turn against them too.
By the third week of January 1547, Whitehall stank. No amount of rose oil, cinnamon satchels, or orange-studded pomanders could mask it. The smell came from the king's legs, specifically the suppurating ulcers on his thighs and calves. But by now the infection had deeper roots. Physicians knew it. Courtiers knew it. Even the guards standing outside the chamber caught whiffs of it when the door opened. But no one flinched. The charade was still intact. And behind that sealed door, Henry VIII was being eaten alive by his own flesh. Each morning, a team of servants, rotated weekly to prevent collapse or indiscretion, lifted the king from his sweat-drenched sheets and peeled away the bandages on his legs. The smell, one court scribe noted in a private letter, was like sour meat left in the belly of a dead horse. His left leg, the worse of the two, bore an ulcer the size of a child's fist, ringed in black skin and leaking continuously. The bandages themselves had to be changed 4 times a day. When they were late, the pus dried and clung to the linen like glue. More than one servant fainted during the change. His physicians, more alchemists than healers, were divided. One believed the ulcers were divine punishment for Henry's sins. Another claimed it was the humor of fire, trapped in his limbs. One insisted on maggot therapy, placing fly larvae directly on the wound to eat the rotting flesh. The king raged, demanded the man be dismissed, then changed his mind after the pain briefly lessened. The maggot stayed for 3 days. That alone should have ended the pretense. But it didn't. Instead, the kitchen prepared yet another feast. Roast pheasant with gold leaf. Suckling pig stuffed with apples and cloves. Crusted tarts and almond pudding. Because the king, even half delirious, still barked for food. He was consuming enough for 3 men, and digesting like a corpse. His belly bloated further. His bowels rarely moved. Enemas were administered with tubes of boiled goat horn. Camphor and red wine were forced into his system, then drained through syringes and towels. The chambers had to be cleaned with buckets of lye. Once, in a moment of horrifying clarity, Henry muttered, "I am become the whale that swallows all." He wasn't far off. His body was failing from every angle. Teeth gone. Breath sour. Skin paper thin. A rash crept along his back and sides, itchy and weeping. His ankles swelled into grotesque knots. The pressure in his abdomen grew so great that physicians worried the skin might tear. They began strapping silk belts around his midsection, hoping to prevent a rupture. It was like trying to contain a bursting wineskin with string. But the most grotesque detail? He still believed he was in control. He continued issuing orders, even if he could no longer sign them. The dry stamp affixed his authority on execution warrants, trade deals, land disputes. Whether he understood what he was signing is still debated. Some documents from those final days contain contradictions, orders rescinding decisions he had made hours earlier. One decree names a courtier already dead. Another references Lady Jane Grey, in a context that makes no sense. Historians argue whether this was senility or manipulation. Perhaps both. Perhaps men around him, Denny, Seymour, riotously, were using the dry stamp like a ghostwriter's pen. Henry had become an institution, not a man. His bloated corpse still sat on the throne, metaphorically, but others were already puppeteering his fingers. And all the while the treatments became more desperate. A poultice of ground pearls and unicorn horn. A hot compress soaked in bear fat and myrrh. One physician brought from Naples tried applying leeches behind the ears, claiming it would drain sick blood from the king's brain. Another offered an exotic tincture of crushed emeralds and vinegar, priced so high it could have bought a manor. None of it worked. His body was already beyond repair. Inside his veins, poison brewed. Sepsis, though unnamed at the time, had taken hold. His heart strained. His kidneys screamed. And still he lingered, awake some hours, sleeping others, always hovering at the edge. Those hours of lucidity were perhaps the most chilling. Henry would suddenly sit upright, voice clear, demanding reports on the war in France. He asked after ships, inquired about coins, called for a map. Servants would rush to comply, pretending everything was normal, pretending that their sovereign wasn't dying by the minute. But then, without warning, he'd forget why he summoned them. His gaze would slide away. He would ask, "Where is my son?" even though he'd already asked that question 10 times that morning. Prince Edward was kept away on strict orders. Henry wanted the boy remembered, as clean and untouched by illness. But others suspected he didn't want the boy to see what kingship did to a man. One morning Henry tried to stand. He demanded his armor. "The gold one," he growled. "The plate with the griffin." They brought it, polished and used for years. It took 3 men to hold it up. Henry stared at it. It shrank, he muttered, then laughed, a dry cracking sound. Then he wept. He wept for over an hour. A physician tried to comfort him. Henry struck him with a jeweled goblet. The court grew tense. Rumors spread that the king had died and been replaced with a double. That a wax figure had been set in his bed to fool ambassadors. That the queen, Catherine Parr, was secretly feeding him poison. One cook claimed to see her slip something into his wine. The cook was arrested. Tortured. He later recanted, but died anyway. Fear was its own infection. And it spread faster than any ulcer. By January 25th, Henry could no longer rise. His arms barely moved. His breath came in wet gasps. One servant described it as the sound of a dying bellows. His body began to cool. The servants increased the fires, wrapped him in wolf pelts, added heated bricks to the bed. Still his hands went blue. His pulse faded to a soft thrum beneath the waxy skin. His mouth stayed open. The ulcers no longer leaked. They had turned black, dry at the edges like burnt parchment. They whispered that the rot had won, that the king finally was hollow. But even then the court waited. The proclamation had not been made. The bell had not tolled. The ritual had not begun. Because Henry, for all his ruin, still terrified them. His body was monstrous, his mind fractured, his blood poison. But the power that clung to his name still paralyzed everyone around him. Even now, no one wanted to be the first to step forward and say, "The king is dead." And so, in a room where even the windows had been shuttered against the cold, Henry VIII, the man who once broke a church for love, who built castles and crushed rebellions, who turned England on its head, lay motionless beneath his own stench. A feast was still being prepared, just in case. On the evening of January 27, 1547, the sun dipped behind the frost-choked skyline of Whitehall. Shadows stretched like fingers across the palace floors. Inside the royal bedchamber, no one spoke above a whisper. Henry had not opened his eyes for nearly 12 hours. His chest still rose faintly, but the breath was shallow, measured in tremors, not in strength. No more feasts were prepared. The maggots were removed. The bandages remained untouched. There was no point. The body was no longer responding. It merely existed, waiting. At the edge of the chamber, Sir Anthony Denny stood watch. The king's longest-serving gentleman. His scribe. His confidant in these final months. Denny held the authority of proximity. He had sat by the bed for weeks, watching the man disintegrate. And now, he turned toward Bishop Cranmer with a slow nod. It was time. But there was a problem. The king had never formally confessed. He had refused last rites. A final act of stubbornness, or fear. Some whispered that Henry was terrified of what confession would uncover. His sins were not merely personal, they were national. The burning of monasteries, the executions of saints, the annihilation of friends, wives, children. To unburden his soul would mean acknowledging it first. Cranmer approached the bed. The archbishop's face was drawn and pale. He had helped Henry dismantle the Catholic Church. Now he was here to witness the final moments of the man who did it. He took Henry's limp hand in his own. "Majesty," he whispered, "do you die in the faith of Christ?" There was no answer. Cranmer squeezed the hand gently. He repeated the question. And then, a faint pressure. A squeeze. Weak. Ghostly. But there. Cranmer held on. "Then God receive your soul." Henry never spoke again. The king who changed everything, who wrenched England into a new world, died without speaking a word. No bells rang. No herald cried the news. No canon fire. Not yet. The official story held that Henry VIII died in the early hours of January 28th, but those in the chamber knew the truth. His body had already begun to cool the night before. And now a new theater began. Silence remained for 2 full days. Not a soul outside the privy circle was informed. No servants were dismissed. No nobles summoned. The bedchamber was locked, guarded by men loyal to Edward Seymour. In the meantime, the king's body was moved, washed, and wrapped, first in linen, then in waxcloth, soaked with pitch and spices to delay decay. Too late. The stench was immediate. Death had claimed its prize, and it was not gentle. By the second night, dark liquid began to pool beneath the corpse. The skin at the stomach, already distended from years of illness, began to split. A scholar visiting the court later recorded that His Majesty's bowels did burst before the embalmers arrived. Whether it happened that dramatically is still debated, but few deny that the condition of the king's body rapidly declined. Rats appeared in the corridor outside the chamber. 2 cats were found fighting beneath the floorboards. The entire wing began to stink of sweet rot and iron. It would be 2 more days before an official statement was issued. On January 31, 1547, a single proclamation rang out across the courtyard. The king is dead. Long live the king. The transition was seamless, at least on paper. The boy Edward, aged 9, was now King Edward VI. But behind the curtain there was chaos. Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife, wept privately, then retreated to her estate with surprising haste. Some said she feared for her life. Others believed she was simply exhausted, relieved even. She had nursed a dying man for over a year. Now she could breathe. Mary and Elizabeth, Henry's daughters by Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, were informed by letter. They did not return to court. They were not invited to witness the funeral. They had been reinstated into the line of succession only recently, and their political futures remained uncertain. The real maneuvering happened among the men. Edward Seymour wasted no time. He positioned himself as Lord Protector of the realm, a title Henry had never officially granted him. But with the boy king unable to rule and the council too divided to oppose him, Seymour seized power almost overnight. Some historians argue it was a coup wrapped in mourning. Others call it a necessity. The embalming failed. The rot could not be stopped. By the time Henry's coffin was placed in the procession cart, the stench leaked from beneath the velvet drapery. Onlookers commented on the foul perfume. One ambassador fainted. As the body was transported from Whitehall to Windsor, attendants noticed a strange black liquid pooling from the seams of the coffin. It stained the cloth. It dripped onto the wood. Rumors spread quickly, that the king was cursed, that the body was rejecting burial, that he could not find peace. In Sion Abbey, where the body rested overnight, a ghastly event occurred. A dog, stray, mangy, with patches of fur missing, entered the chapel. It crept beneath the coffin. And then it howled. Long, low, mournful. Some said it was the devil. Others thought it was an Bullen returned in spectral form. A friar reportedly muttered, "The judgment has begun." The next day the dog was found dead. Its neck broken. No one confessed to killing it. The funeral itself was a macabre pageant. Trumpets wailed. Black banners hung like skins from the rafters. The bishops wore sackcloth beneath their vestments. The royal choir sang a Latin requiem while the waxy coffin, seeping and discolored, was lowered into the crypt beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given Henry a male heir. Even in death Henry chose Jane. The burial vault was sealed in haste. Lime was poured over the stone. The attendants were silent. No inscription was carved. No monument was raised. Just a coffin. Just a name. The great king, builder of navies, breaker of popes, scourge of France, was lowered into a plain black hole in the ground. For all his grandeur, all his declarations, all his titles, he left behind a body that rotted faster than memory. In the weeks that followed, Whitehall was scrubbed. The tapestries removed. The bedding burned. Some chambermaids were dismissed. Others married off to lesser nobles. The scent lingered in the stones for months. And still Henry's legacy remained. Not just in Prince Edward or in the ruins of the monasteries or in the new Church of England, but in the silence. In the way courtiers avoided the South Corridor. In the stories servants told, of footsteps heard in empty rooms, of a groaning voice muttering Latin from nowhere, of a shadow shaped like a man too large to be human. In the nightmares. Because when a man like Henry dies, he does not go quietly. He becomes part of the walls. The crypt beneath St. George's Chapel, Windsor, was cold. Older than Henry himself, its walls had witnessed centuries of royal decay. But none quite like this. In the years that followed, the body of Henry VIII lay in silence. Beside him, Jane Seymour, his third wife, the only one buried with him, rested with quiet dignity. But visitors claimed that Henry's presence overwhelmed the vault. Candles flickered. Cold gusts burst from sealed corners. One chaplain fainted upon entry, claiming he saw the shadow of a swollen man pass across the stone. The embalming had been a disaster. The coffin, though resealed in haste, remained warped from the initial leakage. Over time the pitch cracked. The wooden base bowed under the weight. Royal undertakers would later admit they had underestimated the bulk of the king's corpse. One noted in a private journal that His Majesty required a sarcophagus of iron, not oak. By 1549, 2 years after Henry's death, the crypt already stank faintly of mildew and something sourer, something like decay. Masons were sent to patch the air vents. They were told it was for temperature control. But the truth? The rot was still winning. Above ground, England reeled. Edward VI, delicate and sickly, ruled in name only. Edward Seymour's regency faltered. Religious unrest surged. The realm was sliding, inexorably toward crisis. Henry's heavy shadow still hung over everything. His laws. His church. His paranoia. Parliament chambers echoed with his ghost. His seal was gone, but his threat remained. And in secret, his old courtiers began to vanish. Some fell to political scheming. Others succumbed to mysterious illness. A handful went mad. One man, Sir William Paget, reportedly clawed open his own skin, muttering about the smell in the king's room, before throwing himself from a gallery window. Scholars debate whether these were signs of guilt, or something more. The court never spoke of the smell, or the dogs that bayed at unseen figures, or the recurring dream many of the old guard began to report. Henry rising from his crypt, bloated and black, crowned in iron, demanding his dry stamp. Still the body remained sealed. Until the reign of Charles I. Nearly a century later, in 1648, parliamentarian forces stormed Windsor during the English Civil War. In their fury against the monarchy, they desecrated tombs, looted relics, and disturbed countless graves. One crypt in particular caught their attention. Henry's. What they found chilled even the hardest soldier. The coffin had ruptured. The lid, split along its side, revealed a nightmare. The corpse within was swollen, blackened, and fused to the lining. Jane's body, by contrast, remained strangely intact, as if untouched by time. One soldier reported that the king's body had burst asunder and grown fat in death, while another claimed the face was still twisted, half a sneer, as if mocking those who disturbed him. They resealed the tomb. Quickly. Some said prayers. Others retched. But the myth was reborn. Now whispers spread beyond the chapel walls. Tales of Henry's corpse feeding off Jane's bones. Of black mold creeping from the crypt. Of dreams shared by the king's descendants, each vision more disturbing than the last. Even Charles II years later would avoid Windsor at night. The question still lingers, what became of Henry in death? His empire cracked within a generation. His son died young. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, wrestled the country between fire and brilliance. His church survived, but his bloodline did not. And the body? It remains beneath St. George's Chapel to this day, though few dare visit. Tour guides skip over it. Historians step lightly. Because even now, more than 475 years after his death, the story has not ended. Visitors report strange sounds beneath the chapel. Low thumps. Like something shifting slowly. A scraping along old stone. The smell just faint, of burning herbs and rotting meat. And always that same nightmare. A great, lumbering man in shadow. Dragging himself through death. Crowned. Smiling. Alive. Word count, 1037. Wind down, 300 words. The story of Henry VIII's final days is not just a tale of royal decline, it is a portrait of power stretched to its breaking point. The body that once strutted through banquets and battles, now bloated with infection, leaking into history. The mind that redefined England, now fragmented into hallucination and fear. There is something profoundly haunting about watching a man so great unravel. Yet, that is the nature of mortality even for kings. The throne could not shield him from sepsis. The titles could not spare him pain. And in the end, for all the silks, swords, and servants, Henry died alone in a room too afraid to admit it. What he left behind was not just a legacy of churches and wars, but a lesson. A body, no matter how royal, will fail. Power, no matter how absolute, will be inherited. And history, no matter how carefully curated, will remember the rot. In the quiet stillness of Windsor, beneath the chapel floor, few visitors think to question. He remains, a once great king now folded into dust. The myth of him lingers. The sound, the scent, the whisper in stone. But the man? Gone. And perhaps, at last, forgiven by time. Sleep now, Henry. Let England turn the page.